I still hear it all the time. They'll mention that they have church hurt. And I think a lot of times that gets used as a cover up, and they'll say, oh, you're struggling with church hurt. And the woman that you quote from in the book, her therapist was like, no, that's spiritual abuse. It's not just church hurt. And the pastors too, it's easy for them to explain it away because they say, can't leave church. You need to just put that stuff by the wayside and come back because God wants you in church. Well, I spoke with therapists who have made a lot of church folks angry because they tell their clients, don't seek therapy in the church, because the main goal of a therapist in the church is to keep you in church. But if that's the body that hurt you, you have to get out to find healing. So I think language really matters, and naming this stuff is important.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Broken to Beloved podcast. If you're looking for practical resources for recovery from and safeguarding against spiritual abuse, then this is the place for you. I'm your host, Brian Lee. As an ordained pastor and spiritual abuse survivor, I know what it feels like navigating life after spiritual abuse. I also know what it's like to want to prevent anything from happening to the people you know and love. It's why Broken to Beloved exists. Giving Tuesday is coming up on December 2nd, and we could use your help. We're hoping to raise $3,000 in monthly donations, and you can help make a big difference in sustaining our work by giving just $10 a month. You can set up your monthly donation today at the link in the show notes. Today, we're talking about the influence of megachurches on our evangelical and/or Christian culture. Scott Latta is an award-winning journalist who has spent a decade reporting for humanitarian organizations on conflict, displacement, and climate change around the world. He's the author of his new book, Gods of the Smoke Machine: Power, Pain, and the Rise of Christian Nationalism in the Megachurch, which explores how large churches coalesce power and political influence. He lives in Oregon, and this was such an interesting and fascinating conversation. There's so much validation of the stories that I've heard from you and from our community. So I hope you feel seen, I hope you feel heard, and I hope you feel like this offers some more resources for you. And so now, here's my conversation with our new friend, Scott. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. Your book covers so many different aspects of evangelical church culture. And I appreciate the way that you approach it from this journalistic background, right? It's not an expose, it's not just hearsay, it's not necessarily personal experience, but you're reporting on what so many other people have shared with you. I'm curious if there was one aspect of that reporting that you found especially surprising.
Oh, I found a lot of it surprising. Yeah, I think I kind of decided early on I was just going to kind of start with a general inquiry and see where it led me. And it led me to a lot of surprising and interesting places. I think the one thing that was important for me at the start was I wanted the book to be driven by people's personal stories. I think that was always really important in a book about large churches because, in so many of these spaces, it's hard to have a personal story. It's hard to feel like you have a voice in a space like that. Yeah. And so, the conversations were kind of difficult sometimes, but yeah, I think what made the project rich and fulfilling in the end was that it was surprising along the way where it led me. The book, I think that was kind of weird in some places. I think it's kind of a weird little book, but it was a fun experience in the end.
Yeah. What drove you to write it? Like, what drew you to the topic to start asking questions around it?
Yeah. So, I grew up in a large church. I grew up in a large SBC church in Alabama. And so I knew this world. I still have family in large churches and friends in large churches. So certainly it was a world that I was familiar with. I think there was kind of a writerly curiosity, I would say, about some trends that I've seen in the last maybe 5 to 10 years. And so I think maybe we've all kind of seen numbers, right, about evangelicalism in the US, that numbers are kind of going down. Fewer people are going to church now than they were, 10 years ago. I think that's pretty well established. At the same time, though, the median megachurch is growing. Megachurches are growing in a lot of ways. And so from 2015 to 2020, the median megachurch grew 10%, which I thought was just kind of curious and interesting. And so that immediately had me wondering why, what's leading to that trend, what's leading to that growth. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But, I haven't been in a large church regularly in a while. And I think it took having the space away from that world to kind of see it through a more reporter's eye rather than if I had kind of been in it in the heat of the moment. But yeah, I would say it was just a mixture of like my personal experience plus this kind of sociological trend that we're seeing.
Yeah. And so with the book out, what are you hoping for with it?
Well, I'm hoping my overarching hope for the book, I would say, is that people who have had harmful or hurtful experiences in large churches feel seen, and that it continues the really hard and good work of normalizing conversations about spiritual abuse in the church, because I think that really is the engine of the book, is about how some of these really large churches have, existed outside formal structures of accountability, or they have coalesced power. Like one man at the head of a system can coalesce power. I think that's problematic and it leads to some dangerous areas. And so I hope that the book continues the conversation about that, and that it becomes easier for people who have been hurt in large churches to talk about it and to know that they're not alone, that other people can walk that road with them.
Yeah. And I think you do a really incredible job of highlighting all these individual stories, but it's also clear just how tied together they are, even though they have completely distinct experiences.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things about megachurches is that you really start to see patterns, right? And I think that's because they're large systems in the same way that like a university or the military or the corporate world, you just start to see patterns about how these systems were built, how they exist to kind of protect people at the top in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I even asked, there's a gentleman I interview in the book who's an attorney who sues churches on behalf of survivors of abuse. And he's one of the really interesting characters of the book, I think, Billy Graham's grandson. And yeah, he's doing really important,
He's
heroic
great.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I asked him about these patterns, and because I had spoken with some women who had experienced personal abuse from their pastor, and so many of the details just lined up. They were in different parts of the country, but so many of the details lined up. And I asked him about that, and he said it's the exact same thing. You see it everywhere, like just like step by step. How in this case, how the women were kind of isolated and drawn deeper into the funnel of the church, and then set apart from their spouses, even so that the pastor had alone time with them. They went to work for the pastor, so they had lots of individual one-on-one time. It's just things like that. You really started to see patterns emerge, which I thought was interesting, but also really disturbing when you got into stories about power and abuse.
Yeah. Well, in this community, there's so much talk around, again, hundreds and thousands of these experiences for completely unrelated churches, pastors, leaders. And I hear it so often. I've said it plenty of times myself, and you say it in the book. It's like they're reading from some kind of handbook.
Yeah. And I'm interested in your perspective on this too, as someone who's been in the world for a long time. When we get into conversations about like accountability and structure and how these churches are set up, maybe why that is, like, I think there's something kind of inherent about a large system that, I think these large systems exist to protect themselves. I think they're, especially the men at the top, especially when you get into conversations about money and net worth and power and political power and influence, it all becomes, about reaffirming the person at the head of that system and the layers of protection that exist around them. That's another thing that we saw in the book, was just how many layers of protection, handpicked overseers, handpicked trustees, family members in leadership positions in the church was a very common thing. I'm interested in your perspective too on that, Brian, about like what you've seen over your career and why you think that is.
Yeah, well, I think you nailed it. It's the layers of protection around either the person in charge or the system in charge. And it's interesting because there's so much talk and language around accountability and responsibility and all these things, but that's not really what they're building in at all. That these systems, like you're saying, are often handpicked by the pastor. So it's like, well, how can you be held accountable to them if you picked them? Right? Because they already owe you now. And there's this power dynamic and power differential that's happening. And so many times over and over and over again, it comes down to, for me, holding on to some sort of power and control. If I can hold on to the reins of power and control or influence and authority, or however you want to label it, then everything will be fine. And as soon as something challenges that, then that's when you move into squash, right? And I find it interesting because you also talk later in the book about these large systems, and whether it's Acts 29 or SBC or any of these other places, there are plenty of denominations and or structures and systems that talk about autonomy, right, for these churches. So you have these organizational coverings, sort of, but then they also say, but all of these individual churches are like voluntary fellowships. So we can't actually do anything. We can't hold them accountable, even though we say that we count them as one of ours.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, the majority of megachurches now are non-denominational. So they're not even affiliated with a denomination. So that you wouldn't even have denominational oversight, which I don't really think is legitimate external accountability, but you don't even have that anymore. And so the organization that I spent some time on in the book is called ARC, the Association of Related Churches, based in Alabama. And they have that legal disclaimer that you mentioned, that even though I'd say it's a very fraternal, tight network of like-minded men who are friends and who often are asked to hold each other accountable, they have this very clear disclaimer that all the churches are autonomous. And so then when you get into questions about, okay, then what do we mean by accountability in that situation? Well, there's a pastor in the book, a former pastor. Well, he had a former megachurch. It fell apart, but he was in Jacksonville. And when he had a scandal, he gave an interview to a local reporter in Jacksonville. And he said, I have two kinds of accountability. I have my trustees and I have my overseers. They're chosen by me. He said that. And like, he saw that as a good thing, right? So he from his perspective, he was like, well, these are my friends. So I can trust that they're going to hold me accountable if something happens. I think the big question of the book is that accountability? Like, can you actually trust your friend to actually hold you accountable if you do something, damaging to a person or hurtful or unbiblical or even abhorrent and terrible? So I do think that's kind of one of the big questions driving the book. And ARC is so influential now. They've planted over 1,000 churches on 5 continents. And so this is a trend we're going to see more and more of. And I think that's kind of one of the big questions going forward.
Yeah. Well, and you write about all of the, I don't know what phrase I want to use that's safe, but it like you're saying, there are these structures and systems set up where they choose each other and they just kind of keep passing the torch back and forth. It's like, well, you promote me, I'll promote you, you do this here and I'll do that there. And they take care of each other. And it's this insulated network that feels impossible to get into. And then once you get in, you've worked so hard to get there. Why would I'm going to fight and do everything I can to keep it and maintain it. Right. And then you also talk about Chris Hodges and the whole restoration thing that he wants to be his legacy. And I think for people in our community who have experienced harm at the hands of ARC churches, Acts 29 church, like plenty of places that, and I think this is across the board in any denomination and every non-denomination, that these abuses happen in both these mega churches and in the small places. There's a quote you had at the beginning that I thought was great, if I can find it. For every notorious public controversy, there are countless quieter hurts in large churches that go unnoticed by all of those except for those who are forced to bear them. And that the size of the church doesn't dictate the size of the abuse because it happens everywhere.
Yeah.
And so it feels like these systems are stacked against everyday normal people who fall prey to this kind of stuff. And again, I don't even know how many stories you tell in the book. There are so many individual and collective stories. I mean, at the end of it all, what is your impression? For someone who grew up in church and is trying to find their way, where do you land right now? I'm curious.
Yeah. So the last church that my wife and I regularly attended was a megachurch. We were living in Nashville at the time. We were kind of floating around trying to find a place to land. And so, there's so many megachurches in Nashville. We were just kind of doing that. And I think when I look back on it now, 15 years later, we were really kind of grasping at something that we weren't going to find. So, I walked away from church in my 20s, and I think a lot of it was because of what I had seen behind the curtain, having worked in churches and having, worked in Christian publishing for a while and seeing kind of the commoditization of belief and, how much money was involved. And so it did feel kind of awkward to go back in some ways, I think, and spend 2 years reporting. And I did kind of feel like a mole sometimes, like with my notebook sitting in a church. But I mean, the thing about reporting in megachurches is, I didn't speak to anyone. No one talked to me. Like, I didn't speak to a soul. Like, you float in, you float out. No one shakes your hand. Like, no one asks you your name. I think that's what draws people to them sometimes. There's a lot of reasons people go to large churches, but I think that is unique to really large churches, is the anonymity and the cover that they provide, because, you could just float in and out. No one knows you exist. There was a woman I was speaking to about the book, and she said, the hard truth is at a church this size, you could drop dead and your pastor wouldn't even know. Right. So, and so the question she had asked was, when you die, who's going to preach at your funeral? If you go to a church with 20,000 people, 40,000, 80,000 people, some of these ultra mega churches, right? I just think they're just very culturally interesting. I think they have a lot to say about what we look for in community, what we look for right now in belief in church, and especially post-pandemic, what that even means. But yeah, I mean, it was hard to not be kind of cynical. And I mean, a lot of times I would cycle between being angry, being frustrated, being cynical, but then also being, filled with hope and like to see the resilience in the people I met. And I have to say, you asked at the beginning, what was surprising? One of the most surprising parts of reporting the book, honestly, was how much I enjoyed my conversations with pastors in the book. I think that really surprised me, was I would get off the phone with a pastor, especially a smaller church pastor, and I would be like, you know what? I feel really good about that conversation. That felt really like fulfilling. I really enjoyed talking to him. So I try to stay open-minded about it. But yeah, I had a lot of great conversations with pastors, because they, especially small churches, because they see these things too. I mean, they're affected by them just as much as anyone else.
Sure. Well, and I think, the church has the subtitle talking about megachurches and about Christian nationalism and all these pieces, and how these megachurches end up swallowing communities. Yeah. And swallowing these smaller churches. That whole thing about the lodge at the Church of the Highlands and the path that had been completely fenced and blocked off. And it's like, well, of course they did. Why wouldn't they? They don't have to ask permission for anything. They just do what they want. And I think the side effects of these smaller churches and smaller pastors of these smaller churches that you're talking about, you feel it from all sides, whether you're directly involved with a megachurch or not, if you're just in the community with one. Or maybe even under threat of becoming a part of a community that has a branch or a local, like you call them, franchises, which is basically what they are. The danger is kind of like looming there, right?
Yeah, totally. Well, I think some of that is because we've seen like this complete flip in the megachurch model in the last 20 years where, so the large churches I grew up in the 80s and 90s, that was the big auditorium, the Joel Osteen Church, the big 1990s sanctuary with the steeple on it. I mean, that's completely flipped now so back in 2070, I think it was 77% of megachurches were single site. So they had a big building.
Wow.
Now that's 30%. So just in 2 decades, now that's completely flipped. 70% of megachurches are multi-site now. And so like we mentioned Church of the Highlands in Alabama, they just last week opened their 26th campus. They paid $4 million cash for it. And there's another church, CCV, Christ Church of the Valley in Phoenix. They have 18 locations just in Phoenix. And so I became interested in what's it like pastoring a really small church down the road from one of those. So I started just reaching out to small church pastors close to CCV locations in Phoenix. And those are the conversations I really enjoyed. And they were like, it's the elephant in the room for sure. But CCV, I heard pretty much across the board that the pastors really felt like they had been good neighbors in Phoenix specifically, where, I mean, just practically, they've given a lot of cash away to small churches. They'll call a small church and be like, we want to give you, some money. How much money do you need and what do you want it for? And I was like, I guess that's the right way to be a mega church, is to just like give your money to small churches. But I mean, they're still just a colossal titan in Phoenix. But yeah, I think that you can't overstate the impact that these churches have on their communities. I mean, Church of the Highlands has dominated the state of Alabama, just flat out, in a way that I did not see growing up. There were probably a half dozen churches in Birmingham that were a bigger deal than them. They have now thoroughly dominated the landscape in that state and nationwide. They're the number 2 biggest church in America. And so, yeah, it's been a fascinating, very rapid shift.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I had interactions with Church of the Highlands and ARC, I think 2018 was kind of like my first awareness of them, even though I had heard about Growth Track and all these other systems that they implement that all these other churches take part in. But I got to go to my first conference, I think, there in 2018. So reading a lot of the stories that you tell and about Highlands College and all these other things and the things that are happening there, it's these systems that it makes sense why people are drawn into them. I get the appeal. I mean, Chris is such an incredibly charismatic guy and a very dynamic speaker. It makes sense why people are drawn into that. And yet, there is so much truth and fact about things that are happening that people just want to dismiss or turn their heads away from or deny are happening.
Yeah.
And I feel like, do you feel like there's a reckoning coming with the amount of research that you did, the stories that you were telling? There are boiling points, like some of the open letters that were written and the responses to those. Do you have a sense for response that's happening out there?
So I know that I think that's yet to be seen. I know that I would say definitely in the last few years there's been an increase in reporting from like actual journalists in Alabama who have started to hold them to account more about the restoration practices, which is important because you didn't see that before. You mentioned the open letters. I think people are more comfortable now speaking openly about harms that they experienced specifically at Church of the Highlands. So I hope so, because I mean, you're right that I see a pattern and a practice over many years of them just being not willing to engage with criticism about the things that they've done. And that's not me saying that. That's people who like go to church and were like in the inner circle of that church. So there's a woman in the book who went to Highlands College, and we could talk about megachurch colleges because that's a rapidly growing phenomenon. It's really fascinating. But so they have started Highlands College now. It's $42,000 a year, by the way. It's one of the most expensive colleges in the state of Alabama. It's a 2-year program. And she went through it. She had a really, really kind of devastating, painful situation when she got out and tried to get a job and ended up in therapy for a decade with like 4 different therapists. She tried to engage with them and felt dismissed every time. She was told to submit to her pastors. She was not taken seriously. And she said that if you approach a church that size with your personal story, it's so easy for them to dismiss you because that's just your personal experience. And well, obviously that's not a problem because look how fast the church is growing. Look how big we are. You know, look at the mission that we're fulfilling. So this is just your experience. She said the only way to actually get their attention is to raise the voice of the collective of a group of people who have experienced that. And she said to Church of the Highlands in particular, she said they have a culture where the phrase that she heard so much is that silence is honoring. That's the phrase she heard. Silence is honoring, which was their way of saying don't engage with outside criticism. And I mean, Chris Hodges has said this to local reporters that he doesn't give interviews because he feels like they're not treated fairly. Well, what's the cost of that? If you don't engage with it and you don't speak the truth about what's happening, there's going to be speculation rampant in the community, which is, I think, where we're at right now in Birmingham specifically, is that people just don't know what's happened there because they're not willing to engage with it because of a culture that they've intentionally fostered. I think that's fair.
Yeah. You share her story. I think you tell it really well. And I hear her voice in it, which I appreciate because I think that's one of the hardest things for survivors and victims is that their voice is often stripped.
Yeah.
And that their story gets told for them by whoever wants to control the narrative. Right. And the way that you sum it up, I think you say, like, when she tries to bring it up to and it's not even like a thing about it. She just asks a simple question in a staff meeting. She's like, hey, why are there no part-time staff here? Right. And they completely shut her down. And you just say fewer than 20 words, less than 10 seconds. And it took her 12 years to work through it in therapy. And I think that sums up so much of the experience of people in this community, that you're primed for this kind of behavior and for this kind of abuse, that we are groomed through these different situations and the need to belong, the need to submit, the need to just go along with the culture of a place. And then all it takes is that one question or that one incident that just turns it all on its head.
Yeah, totally. I think you've nailed it exactly. And I think the issue at the core of that is the pastor in that specific moment needed to reestablish her authority in the room. Like you could not question her authority because that authority was granted to her by God. And so to question your pastor is to question God, and you cannot do that. And so if you have any question for your pastor, if you have any note of criticism, it gets shut down immediately. I mean, Chris Hodges has said, there's a video, and I quoted in the book, that he does not feel like he can be brought criticism from anyone beneath him. Like he feels like that's biblical. Which I asked pastors about that too, Brian. I'm interested in your perspective on that, about as a pastor, who is allowed to criticize you, because his perspective on record is that people beneath his station, his level on the org chart, are not biblically able to criticize him.
Yeah, no, that's bonkers.
Most pastors laughed when I said that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that again shows you his need, conscious or unconscious, to hold on to power and control. right? The fact that you can't tolerate criticism from anyone below you. And of course you're at the top. So you're saying you can't tolerate criticism from
Right.
anyone it's just so antithetical to what being a Christ follower is supposed to mean, I think,
Yeah.
right? It's like that we're called to be the lower you go is kind of the pastors are called to be servants, and yet they lord it over you, which is what the scripture specifically talks about as the definition of spiritual abuse. Right in the New Testament, it's like, for those who are lording it over people, like, I'm going to say this to you instead. Wow. And you have this whole situation set up where if no one can criticize you, then of course you set yourself in this place to be the one with ultimate authority, which of course is going to set up the prime things for just abusive things to happen.
Yeah.
And then you set yourself as this kind and benevolent person who's going to restore other pastors back to their ministry after horrendous abuses of power. Again, I love the conversations you're having with Boz Chivichyn, right? He started Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in Christian Environments, which is an incredible organization. And I love the way that he talks about abuse and malpractice and all these other things. He's saying, as a lawyer, if I have sex with a client, I lose my license. As a doctor, any sexual contact with patients, even if consensual, I'm prosecuted and lose my license. But if you're clergy, if you're a spiritual leader, which often has a greater position of authority and influence because of the spiritual component, and then you do that with someone under your care or a parishioner or a volunteer or a staff member, it means nothing to most states.
Yeah. No, I mean, adult clergy sexual abuse is not a crime in all states. And so, and of course, you don't have to have a license to be a pastor. You don't have to go before a board. We can start a megachurch this afternoon, and we could, devise our own system of accountability or not. And this is the other thing too, though, if your church does try to hold you accountable, you don't have to accept it. You could just say no,
right?
Like in Mark Driscoll's case, and you could resign and just go start another church 3 states away. Right. So, I think Boz is right. And I will say, he really tried to give churches the tools they would need to prevent abuse. Yeah. And the work that Grace does, like you said, is so important. And the abuse is continued. And so the only way forward was to start suing them. And because it's not a crime in most states, civil restitution is often the only accountability you can even go after, is to try to get a settlement. And so the case of Robert Morris at Gateway Church, it opens the book. And so that was really the big story that broke in the reporting for the book, was his sexual abuse of Cindy Clemenshire in Oklahoma when she was a child. And he's in jail right now only because the attorney generals in Oklahoma found an old law they were able to prosecute him on. When I met with Boz, they thought there was no option for criminal restitution for that case for 4 years of sexual abuse, because it was past the statute of limitations. They were only able to get it on kind of a legal Hail Mary, which is why he's in jail. But for so many of these clients, it becomes he said, she said, especially if it happens behind the closed doors of the church or literally in the pastor's office, which happens a lot. And so, the churches are fighting it. And Boz said, the reason that I think he's righteously angry, and rightfully so, about so many of these cases is because he sat at those tables with survivors, and he said the pastors they never show.
Yeah,
they
never show up.
They send their lawyer, they send their representative, but they don't come. And so, yeah, of course he's angry. Why wouldn't he be? And I was angry too, just hearing the stories. But I think it's a huge problem.
Absolutely. Well, and I forget where it is in the book, but there's just all these parenthetical statements after all these reports of pastors being removed or resigning their positions in churches. And then 6 months later, and then 10 months later, and then 8 months later, they pop up again here or there or whatever it is. And oftentimes it's months, it's not even years.
Yeah, because there's no hard and fast rule about how long a pastor should be out of the pulpit, right? There's not a number in scripture that you can turn to. And so, I found a really interesting study from Lifeway Research where they asked a number of pastors, how long should a pastor step away from the pulpit if they commit some sort of, quote, moral failing? And there's no agreement among the number at all. And so, John Piper has said 10 years. John Maxwell, I believe, said for life, but some pastors say 1 year, 2 years. You see 2 years, that's really common, but sometimes it's 6 months. And every kind of pastoral restoration process is unique to you. It's kind of a bespoke restoration process that your handpicked overseers, in many cases, design. So you step aside, you go through counseling, you read books, you go to events, and then, like in Church of the Highlands case, the pattern that you see is they bring on guys onto their staff from other churches who have these often quite serious allegations against them. They bring them on. They have staff members on record with reporters in Alabama saying they were not told why these pastors were there. The congregation was not told why these pastors were there. And then so for 2 years, they're kind of laundered through and paid, and then they're put back in the game, and these guys are not preaching in other churches. And so I think that is kind of unique to really large churches. I know it happens everywhere, but I think that it's worth pointing out that large churches really have the resources to do that, because they have the money to do that. And these networks like ARC and these other church planting networks, these guys, like, they get to know each other, and it's so easy to move them from one church to another.
Well, and I think even the anonymity that you talked about at the beginning with megachurch, like, I can just walk in and no one can know me, which for some people is really comforting because they don't want that kind of attention. And with churches like those kinds of resources, they also get that kind of anonymity on staff. It's like, just, oh, great, another body is showing up. We don't know who this guy is or where he's coming from or what the story is.
Yeah.
And then the other, like, really wretched part is, like, that they're put in positions of youth ministry or direct contact with underage children or whatever it is, or minors. And it's just like, I don't understand how you keep perpetuating that thing.
Yeah.
Knowing the story or knowing the allegations against them.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I was reading Chris Hodges' quotes on this about why he has said that he wants pastoral restoration to be the thing he's known for. And I mean, Johnny Hunt, former president of the SBC, he's restored, by his telling, hundreds of pastors, 400 pastors. And then, of course, he's been restored twice because of allegations against him. So ridiculous. But it's because that they felt, Hodges in particular has said that he felt that, these guys who commit infractions or moral failings, is often explained away, or just cast by the wayside, and you're out of the game. Well, you know what? If you talk to women about this, or people who advocate for survivors, they hear that and they say, good, go find something else to do. You have blown it. You're no longer allowed to be in the game if you abuse your power. Because one thing that I learned in the reporting for this book is that there is no such thing as a pastoral affair. There's no affair, an extramarital affair for your pastor. It's abuse of power.
Yes.
And because of the power dynamic, and especially the spiritual authority you have over someone, it's abuse of power. And so when you talk to women about this issue, they say, good, go work at Home Depot, go work somewhere else, go sell insurance. You have lost the right to have spiritual authority over someone's life. Sorry, I'm getting fired up about this again, because it's taken me back to my conversations with people about this, right? Yeah. And it's just, the perspectives are wildly differing on each side of this issue.
Yeah. Well, I think, like you're saying, the cultural part of it, the patriarchy that pervades so much of that culture, has so much to do with that response. And I think it is a righteous anger. I'm here for it all day long, Scott.
Well, the other thing is, like, when you mentioned, like, patriarchy, like, women aren't in leadership positions in these churches. Yeah. That's the other thing too, right? So it becomes so easy to cover up. Is that I spoke to someone in the book in the evangelical world, and I asked him, is there something about megachurches that makes him more prone to cases of abuse? And he was, like, very passionately said no. And he said that I encourage you to look at other large systems like universities, the military, the corporate world. And there's just a math case. If there is abuse in megachurches, it's because they have more people on staff. Well, I was surprised to hear him say that, because there's huge rates of abuse in those systems. Like, a quarter of women on college campuses report being raped or sexually assaulted. Like, okay, like, that's your defense. And also, in those other systems, women can be in leadership positions in universities, in the military, in the corporate world, and they are not in leadership positions in megachurches. So I think that is intentional. I think that comes back to issues of, like, fundamentalism and legalism that you see that are, I find personally very problematic in the evangelical world. But it affords these men protection and cover for this stuff.
Yeah, it does. Well, and I think part of what I'm learning in terms of what is helpful or serves as a resource to so many people is the idea of naming things correctly. And I think one of the things that your book does really well is provide that kind of language for people to name things. I think it's in the introduction. It's like once she learned the word spiritual, it's like, oh my effing, right? It's like this is exactly, this explains it. And I think for so many people that I've heard from or worked with, it's that same exact light bulb moment. It's like, I thought I was the problem until I learned this word, until I learned spiritual abuse, until I learned about gaslighting, until I, whatever the terms are, having language to name our experiences is such a big deal. And then the validation piece, the allowing, the telling and listening of stories is so huge. And I think your book offers so much of that in a beautiful way, where you don't try to take over the narrative. You're not providing commentary. It's just like, here's what happened. Let's lay out the facts. Here's the evidence and the proof of what happened. Here are the communications that were going on. And it's really hard to take away from that. It's like, oh no, I'm for the pastor, right? No, he was right. It's like, no, there's just, he had to, and the amount, like you're saying, the playbook that they go by, it's like, oh, I was burning out. I wasn't myself. And so I just allowed these things to happen. And I love that you named clearly, no, that's clergy abuse, that there is no affair when it comes to with a pastor because of that power differential.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for picking up on that. I think language is really important. And so you mentioned the kind of the pet phrases people have for some of this stuff. When we were looking for a title for the book for a while, I thought about just calling it church hurt, because that is the pet phrase that people use. And it's so funny that I still hear it all the time, just organically in conversation with people. They'll mention that they have church hurt. And I think a lot of times that gets used as a cover up, and they'll say, oh, you're struggling with church hurt. You have church hurt in your background. And the woman that you quote from in the book, her therapist was like, no, that's spiritual abuse. That's abuse. It's not just church hurt. Like, it's so easy to just explain it away. And the pastors too, it's easy for them to explain it away because, they say, don't leave church. You can't leave church. You need to just put that stuff by the wayside and come back because God wants you in church. Well, I spoke with therapists who have really, made a lot of church folks angry because they tell their clients, don't seek therapy in the church, because the main goal of a therapist in the church is to keep you in church. But if that's the body that hurt you, you have to get out to find healing. And maybe you come back in a different way down the road, but it just becomes perpetuating a cycle at that point of trying to keep people in. So I think you're right, Brian. I think language really matters, and naming this stuff is important because, and thankfully so many people before me have done so much work, like laying that path and laying that groundwork. And your show also is such an important part of that, of just normalizing these conversations so people feel comfortable. But I mean, that was kind of one of the encouraging parts of the reporting, was seeing how many people were doing that work. And there's groups out there. One that I found really interesting was called the Post-Evangelical Collective, which is this group of churches that are trying to find a way forward outside the strictures of evangelicalism, which I thought was interesting. There's one called the Restored Voices Collective, or it's an online healing group of people who have experienced abuse in the church. So that's so much good work being done, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's part of why we intentionally stay away from the phrase church hurt, because I think we're doing it to minimize what happened. I get why people use it, because they don't know what else to call it, or because they don't want to identify what actually happened, we use the phrase church harm. It's like, no, you weren't just hurt, you were harmed.
Interesting. So you see that phrase a lot too then?
Yeah. We hear it all the time. Church hurt. It's like, what are you minimizing? What are you not wanting to actually admit or own? Right. It's like you were harmed in that environment. You weren't just hurt by it.
Yeah.
There was an active sense of harm. It's also, people get so hung up on, it's like, oh, well, you keep harping on this thing, or can't you let go of it yet, or just get over it, or are you still talking about it, right? And there's such an outsized influence of megachurches and megachurch pastors, right? And I love that you talk about it. You say pastors who commit abuses may be lone wolves statistically, but a wolf can only hurt one thing at a time. But the impact of these men, Dino Rizzo, 8,000 people, Mark Driscoll, 15,000 people, Bill Hybels, 25,000, 3 isolated incidents, in quotes, acting out their impulses behind closed doors, affect 48,000 people. And then again, you talk about Johnny Hunt, right? Elected head of 40,000 churches. And the impact that has is just wild.
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of the thing that I had to keep reminding myself when working on this, was that megachurches are like 1% or less than 1% of the total churches in the US, like statistically tiny minority. And when we talk about the ultra mega churches, you're like Church of the Highlands, it's even more, because just to qualify as a mega church, the statistical definition is like 2,000 people. So these churches that have 20, 40, 60,000, they're kind of the exception. Most mega churches are kind of small, quote unquote, by that standard. But the influence that they have is wild. And I think actually Mark Driscoll's a good example of this. So I went to his church in Scottsdale, Trinity Church, and on a given weekend, 4,000 to 6,000 people will come through the doors of Trinity Church in their services. But when he posts a video online on YouTube, he gets 100,000 views, 200,000 views. And so then you think about, like, what does it even mean to be a megachurch pastor in 2025? Like, where are you going to devote your attention and your energy if you can reach 4,000 people in a pulpit or 200,000 people online? You talk about, like, being a pastor now just means so much more. It means like your brand, your Instagram, your YouTube, your TikTok, all that stuff. And they see it as part of their ministry, but I see it as part of their brand. And the brand at a megachurch, the brand of the church becomes so intertwined with the brand of the pastor. They become so enmeshed that one just becomes the other. And so that's why when Driscoll stepped down from Mars Hill Church, that church dissolved instantly. They were gone instantly, like 15 campuses, because he was the church. And so that's a lot of pressure to put on someone, right? That I think, is pretty unhealthy. And that's what you see a lot now, especially at this level.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the statistic that the average church would fit on a school bus. I talk about that a lot. It's like the average church in America, I think, is about 65 people. Yeah. And so when you talk about that 1% and just the outsized influence that they have on all of culture, and then you talk about the influence that they have, you talk about the Seven Mountains philosophy, right? You talk a lot about politics, Christian nationalism, Sean Feucht, all these things that are happening. What is your take on the influence of these mega churches, of the smoke machines, both literal and metaphorical, of the things that they're throwing out there? What do we make of all of it?
Well, that's a great question. I think it probably is the big question. And I think I've come around to believe that their influence is only going to get bigger as we see these shifts in evangelicalism in the U.S. So, I mean, the truth is, I think people are starting to consolidate in large churches, especially post-COVID, when a lot of smaller churches didn't make it. Megachurches were built for COVID, right? You could attend your megachurch from your bed, watching on your phone. You could give your tithe or offering on your phone. You don't have to go in person. So they were really built to survive the pandemic when a lot of smaller churches didn't. So now they're cutting themselves a larger piece of the pie, even though the pie is smaller of evangelicals in the U.S. Megachurches are getting more of it. And so, I mean, you talk about political influence. I think it's fair to say the system has never been set up to be more open to megachurch pastors getting direct influence and access to the levers of power of the U.S. government than ever. And I think that, I mean, Driscoll's a good example of this again, because he shared a story one time where it was Charlie Kirk in Arizona introduced Driscoll backstage to J.D. Vance. And I mean, that's access and power immediately to the vice president. And I mean, that's not something we saw, I think, as much growing up in like the 80s and 90s as far as political influence goes. So, I mean, I think megachurches are going to grow. I think they're going to take over more smaller churches where the congregations age out and those churches don't make it. Their megachurches are young. They're diverse. The congregations love their churches. They're fired up for them. So I think they're going to grow. And then politically, I mean, there's really nothing stopping them now from consolidating as much political power or influence as they want. It's so easy now.
Yeah. I'm like struggling with a war in my brain of where to go with all of that, because there's a part of me that recognizes that wanting to influence culture through politics or through whatever, I get it. And yet it has become so misguided and misused and abused that the draw to power, because like you're saying, it lands you in the Oval Office, this kind of influence and power, in pictures, laying hands and praying for a president.
Right.
And it's so bizarre to me, the obsession with celebrity culture, especially in the evangelical church world, that somehow that earns you. I think it used to be in the 80s growing up. It's like, if you heard about a star who was a Christian, somehow it's like, they're one of us, right?
Right.
And there was a sense of validation that you get. And so I get that, because it was and today I think it's even more countercultural now, sort of, to be a Christian, not exactly, but there's this other sense of like, not just one of us, but now it's like, but let's put them in as many seats of power as we possibly can. And again, that comes down to that power and control, which sets us up for abuse. And it's watching those things happen. You write about all these dog whistles, right, that are going off about, and these phrases that make no sense, but everyone signs up or just rallies behind them because it sounds right or because it sounds biblical or whatever it is, that are just creating this mess of landscape out there that are confusing church, spirituality, following, whatever you want to call it, with this intertangling of politics and Christian nationalism and all the things that are going on. Do you, in your conversations with pastors, I'm curious if you heard any defenses of, or what they see as the good fruit of that?
Yeah, well, I think Driscoll in particular was really interesting in reporting the book because I think he's much more openly political than he was when he was at Mars Hill in Seattle. And like, I remember watching his sermons while I was at work, like watching his sermons on iTunes in my 20s, because I was so drawn to what he was doing. And I went to Trinity Church in Scottsdale, and the name of the sermon that was happening that night was, "Should a Christian be a globalist or a nationalist?" Very odd. And so there was absolutely a strong biblical defense that he offered for that perspective. And I mean, he used like the story of the Tower of Babel to show why God is against globalism and why you should be a nationalist, which was I thought a
bit of a reach,
but absolutely. And like, so I went to another church in the book, Dream City Church, which was Charlie Kirk's church, which was very much a pro-Israel rally. And this was just a couple of weeks before the election. And there was a thorough biblical defense of it. So yeah, I think that not only do they want it, I think that they feel biblically called to do it. And so you mentioned the Seven Mountains mandate. So there's great books written on this. There's a really great book called The Violent Take It by Force by Matthew Taylor about New Apostolic Reformation and the more charismatic corners of this world that are really grasping for power. And so the Seven Mountains mandate, the belief there is that Christians are called to dominate the seven mountains of culture, like education, media, etc. And I think they offer like deep biblical defenses of it, which is, I think, part of the reason I find it so disturbing. And now, like, that has now met up with a system that's so open to that, which is why, just like quite practically, you saw charismatic iconography at the Capitol on January 6th. You saw people marching in circles and blowing shofars, right? Because you saw like the melding of that. So you see it on a Saturday night at Trinity Church and you see it at a riot at the Capitol. It's crazy. But yeah, I don't see that getting better like in the near future. There's no reason to think it would. It'll be interesting after Trump, I think, to see where it goes. But as for right now, I think we're definitely in the thick of it.
Yeah. Where do you think we go from here?
Wow. Well, I think there's maybe two ways to think about that. That's a great question. So systematically, as a landscape and a scene, I think there's places we go from here. But I think personally, there's places that I hope we go from here. I think what I was saying earlier is how I feel about the landscape. I think they're only going to consolidate more power. These issues are only going to get worse. I hope that structures of accountability become more commonplace. But like, as Boz says in the book, I don't really know what accountability would even look like in a church at that level, because it's all about money and it's about narcissism and things like that. So where we go from here as a landscape, I think megachurches are going to continue to grow their influence and their real estate footprint and their revenues. Personally, where I have more hope is what we were talking about earlier about how, because of shows like yours and the good work that so many people have done, people start to be more willing to call out toxic behavior, unbiblical behavior, abuse in these large systems, in the same way that we would call it out in the military or in universities or in the corporate world. Like, we need to be willing to do that in the church. And we are. I think, so many people are. And there were so many times that I wanted to just get my voice out of the book and didn't even really feel comfortable with my posture as the writer of telling a person's story. I wish that they could just tell it. That might be a future book, is just literally giving them the voice to do it, because like you said earlier, that's what I really wanted to do in the book, because you can't have a voice in a large church. You can't.
Yeah.
Like, you can't talk to the pastor after the service. You can't sing a solo on Sunday. You can't shape the bylaws. You're not going to do it. And so I hope going forward that people are able to find avenues of healing and honesty, and that these churches pay attention to it, because it's so easy for them to write it off like they always have. I hope that changes.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. I imagine people who pick up your book, pastors who may pick up your book, may find plenty of things to argue with and saying that you're overstating things, or that you're not reporting the truth of stuff, or that you're, making things too big, whatever it is. How would you want to respond to them?
I would respond by saying it's the same reason you would write a book about abuse in other large systems, that any abuse, especially in the church, any abuse is too much abuse. Like any abuse is uncalled for. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? That's kind of how this is, especially in the church. It's not about hating God. It's not about hating Christianity. And in fact, like, so many people I spoke with, their pain is all the more compounded by the fact that they love their church. They wanted to stay in their church. They don't know what to do on a Sunday morning anymore. And they still want to go, and they can't. And so I think that's a reason to ask these questions. And you're right that, these are not universal truths. There are pastors who I'm sure are doing it the right way. Like I said, I spoke with a lot of pastors and enjoyed those conversations. I heard examples where I felt like that was probably the right way to do this sort of thing. I would say in the book, we're mostly talking about like the ultra mega churches, the 20, 30, 40,000 people style churches. So, there's 1,700 mega churches in the US. So there's exceptions to every rule. There's pastors doing it the right way, I'm sure. And most pastors, they do their job. They keep their head down. They're doing it the right way. They care about their congregation. A third of pastors, I think right now, are working 2 jobs. So they're bivocational. So most, many pastors in the US are doing this because they feel called or they feel a labor of love. It's these guys who have consolidated so much power that I wanted to probe at. And I would say you would do that for the same reason you'd write about someone in Hollywood or in the government or in the military, because I feel, it's our job to question the authority and the power of people who have a lot of it. And especially in a system that's designed to protect it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate that you close with the story, the experiences you had with Brian Taunton at Christ Point. It was such a beautiful counterpoint to everything else that you have been talking about, that this tiny church of 20, 30 people and the ways that they're doing community and resisting the pull of what the megachurch is doing. Scott, again, I think you do such a beautiful job highlighting the stories in the voices of the people who experience them, of shining a spotlight on the outsized influence of these mega churches. And again, you're defined 2,000 and up of what's happening behind the scenes. And I think for people who are curious, well, what does that look like? Or I keep hearing about this spiritual abuse thing or this deconstruction thing or whatever it is, I think your book does a really great job just telling the story of what's happening. It doesn't feel like a bias towards one or the other. And I think you just explained it beautifully of why you did it and how you would respond to people who might push back against it. I don't see any pushback against it. I don't see any reason to. It's if it's the truth, it's the truth. Why are we so afraid to hide it? Why are we so afraid to let people hear about what's happening so that we can find the beauty in it or redeem something out of it, right? Or just do something different if it's not the right thing to be doing. Gosh. And so I do. Yeah, I hope people pick it up. Is there, if people want to connect with you online, where do they go?
Yeah, so you can find my stuff at my website. It's just scottlatta.com. I'm on Substack. I have a Substack called Gods of the Smoke Machine, where I've been doing more reporting about some of these issues and some of the more megachurch stories that are breaking in the news. I'm also on Blue Sky. And yeah, I just, thanks for doing this, Brian. I think your work is really important and the show is really important. And like you said, I think that every voice matters, I think. And so I hope that's what the book accomplishes. It's just adding a few more voices to a really important conversation.
Yeah. And I think you do it beautifully. I think the detail that you provide, it's not exploiting any of those voices. It's just allowing them to be shared with the truth of what happened to them and their experience. I found it to be just really powerful hearing those stories from so many different places. And unfortunately, I think it'll really resonate with a lot of people in our community just to feel seen. Like you're saying, people who responded to the open letters like, oh my gosh, this was me too. I think a lot of people will find themselves in those stories and just realize you're not alone. You're not crazy. This thing happened. It was wrong. Everyone go get a copy of Gods of the Smoke Machine wherever books are sold. We'll have links for everyone in the show notes. Scott, thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it.
What a great conversation. If you enjoyed it as much as I did, be sure to follow Scott and say thanks for being on the show. You can find links and all the things in the show notes. Subscribe or follow to get new episodes automatically. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review or share with your friends. It really helps us to grow and continue providing quality content for you. And a special thank you to our listeners who make the show possible through their financial support. If you find this show valuable, consider donating today and joining our mission at brokentobeloved.org/support or at the link in the show notes. This episode was hosted and executive produced by me, Brian Lee. Editing by Heidi Kritz and post-production by Lisa Carnegas. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to listen. I hope it's been helpful. Here's to moving toward healing and wholeness together. I'll see you next time.